for joining us today to discuss the topic of family governance and family constitutions. Our first question to Robbie, could you introduce us the concept of family governance?
Family governance implies a set of rules and guidelines which guide their behavior, guide their decision-making, and allow them to function in a more fluid way. The important thing is to understand that money and wealth is a two-edged sword. It affords you many, many benefits, but at the same time, it's got inherent danger. And the danger is it can have a very corrosive effect on family relationships, family life, and particularly the relationship between generations. I mean, I can give you two examples. I have one example of a family where there was a very significant liquidity event where a business had been run for 15 or 20 years, and all the family's spare money, spare capital was actually reinvested in the business. But at some point, that business, or a large part of that business, was sold. They sold their business for hundreds of millions of dollars, and all of a sudden had a disposable amount of cash that they had to kind of consider what to do with. Obviously, they were speaking to investment advisors, wealth managers, etc., etc. But aside of that, they decided that they were going to change their lifestyle. At the same time, this family had three children, and they were all in their late teenage years or early 20s. And very, very quickly, they were driving fancy sports cars, catching private jets on holiday, and so on and so forth. And when the father first approached me, he approached me with real concern that his children didn't understand the value of the work that he had done to build the family business. They didn't understand the value of work, full stop. And, he was concerned that he'd overindulged them. And it was a justifiable concern. He had overindulged them. And it's very, very difficult at that point to pull back because the expectations actually become much, much more magnified. And that's an instance where family, very, very liquid, very quickly, not quite understanding how to manage it, and with the best of intentions. I think the intention of the parents in this case was, I'd love to give my children the opportunities that I never had, or I'd love to give my children the things that I never had. And I think there's a difference between those two things. Giving people opportunity is one thing. Giving people material assets is something different. And one has to strike a balance between those. On the other side of the coin, I am currently working with a family where the patriarch is in his 80s. It's a very sizable business, and there are 5 children in this particular family. And the oldest child is 57. Okay, just to give you a context. But when I'm working with the family, I get a call from the father to say to me, listen, when you're working with my 57-year-old son, don't meet with him during working hours because he's got to work. He can't take time off. So you have a control situation there, which is the opposite. So there's a lot of asset, but the 80-year-old man is controlling the asset very, very tightly, controlling the behavior of his children very tightly, and you have the opposite effect. So in both of those instances, in the one instance, you need a set of rules to govern the possibility of creating overindulged and with children with high expectations. On the other side, you've got a poor guy who's been working very, very hard in his business, in his father's business for 30 years or even longer, and he has to go to his dad to ask permission to have a meeting and take time off during the day. So again, you need a different set of rules to actually deal with that. The term that I like to use is soft rules. So these are not hard rules that are necessarily legalistic, but they're soft rules that are built out of an understanding of the family situation and what's going to actually empower the family to actually move forward in a positive way. The key, prepare. prepare for liquidity, prepare for handing over control, prepare for whatever the circumstances are that the family finds itself in. And remember that whatever the rule is, the underlying values that shape that rule are absolutely important, in fact, are fundamental, are the most important thing. Mm-hmm. So often our starting point when we work with families is to deal with values.
In your opinion, you think family governance is good to have or must have, or any factors that you think the family, they cannot really neglect when they're having a family governance in place?
So the best way I can describe that to you is imagine that you have 3 cups and they're filled with water, but they're connected at the bottom. So when you pour water into one cup, very, very quickly it levels to the same level across the 3 cups. And then if you pour a little bit of coffee into the one cup, the coffee will dilute, but it will actually penetrate all the 3 cups and in an equal kind of way. And that's the nature of family systems. Family systems are self-leveling systems across different parts of the family's existence. Families who are, obviously they're families as first, a mother, a father, a son and a daughter and so on. Then you have people who are in business together. And then you have people who are perhaps shareholders or investors together. In each of those instances, you have a linkage between those 3 different cups of the family's existence. But whatever you do in the one has an impact on the other. So what we have to think about, I think, in terms of whether you need family governance or don't need family governance, and is it a must-have or a nice-to-have? If there are difficulties, challenges, or issues in the family business, and there's not a set of soft rules around how that's managed, it impacts the family's life as a family. If there's a difficulty or an issue within the family life, it will impact on the business. If you have disputes or disagreements about, for example, dividend policy amongst investors and shareholders, it affects the business and it affects the family. So these systems are all interconnected. Now, what that does is introduces a lot of complexity into the situation. So one of the basic, I think, objectives of family governance is to make sure that you don't contaminate one with the other, and you try and have some boundaries around each one, so that there's a level of in some senses, artificial separateness between these systems. You're trying to create some boundaries around them so that you can manage them distinctly. So one tries to keep these things separate. It's not always possible. It can be very challenging, but it's certainly one of the objectives of having a governance framework in place. Is it a must-have? I think it depends. I think some families just inherently have a set of implicit rules. They understand how these things fall into place, and they can talk about it in a very, it's kind of part of their consciousness. I think other families much less so. And I don't think you have one, I don't think it's one size fits all. I think you have to shape the level of governance, whether you need to codify that into a constitution or not. I think you have to shape that according to the ethos of the family and the way the family functions. I mean, certainly I've got experience of working with a particular family where the implicit rules are so clear to them. They're so well understood. There's what I call the difference between the oral law and the written law. The oral law is being communicated orally from grandparent to parent to child. And it's there's a very strong kind of adherence to that. It's part of the DNA of the family. But in most instances, that's not the case. And you do need to actually have a balance between the oral and the written. And hence, I think governance and constitution is something for people to consider seriously.
As we know that the concept originated from the West, from your opinion, what is the adoption level of such concept in the West? Or maybe you share with us your insights on the developments over the years in Europe.
So whether it's the UK, Germany in particular, France, Switzerland, you know that in those countries you've got family businesses that have been going for many, many generations and many years, and some of them have a listed component. Some of them don't. Some of them are exclusively owned by families. Through banking, those rules and those ways of managing that kind of wealth has grown through generations, and they have formal and informal structures. But the banking world has grown up. The private banking world has grown up very largely around those kind of institutional families. If you take a step back and then you say, well, let's look at the USA. A lot of the academic work comes out of the USA. Why? Because the USA is now, you're now looking at second, third generation. But there's a lot of new wealth over the last 100 years in the US, and of a very significant nature. Many businesses, many large businesses, many organizations in the US started off as family businesses, particularly at the turn of the last century through to the Second World War and beyond. And substantial companies, the Americans did, really built things. So in engineering, in chemical engineering, and so on and so forth. And there's been an academic discipline that's emerged of how to actually deal with families and wealthy families, and that's well seeded within the U.S. universities. Not just the top, not just the Stanfords and the Harvards, but even the smaller universities in the U.S. have faculties that actually look at this kind of thing. Of course, the European universities are, from INSEAD to Oxford to Cambridge to the German universities, are also very involved in this thing now. But it's kind of the US have been the powerhouse of driving the thinking. So I think that there is quite an acceptance now that when you get to a certain size and a certain level of complexity, these things should be addressed. And I think that there's an acceptance that they need to be addressed intellectually. The rub point, however, is there's a gap between intellectual acceptance and emotional acceptance. I mean, very often we'll get somebody, come to us, refer to us, or knock on our door and say, I would really like I'd like a family chart or a family constitution. You start questioning, what is it that you're looking for? What do you really want? The enlightened response is, I need to now think about how I start passing the responsibility and the management of my wealth and the continuity of my family to the next generation. However, the other kind of response is, I need to be able to control the next generation going forward, and use this as an element of control. One's got to be really, really clear when you're looking at entering that kind of discussion. What is the motivation to do so? And having to understand that families are not static things. They are life cycle organisms, and they change. Perspective, children grow older, and they become independent, and they move forward. And you can't always control how they do that. And if your motivation is to grow the independence of the next generation and their responsibility and their capability of managing that responsibility, that's great. If your motivation is simply to try and hold on to control by using a constitutional method to do so, far less adaptive and less of a good reason to do it.
Most Asian families, they do believe that the concept of family governance is very westernized, and they don't think it can be applied to the cultures in the East. So what are your views, Robbie?
And some of the generational shifts that we're seeing are universal. So if we look at what we now call Generation Z, and the perspective that this new generation, first of all, they probably universally across the world the most educated generation ever. But they have concerns about purpose, concerns about the environment, concerns about uh, social equality, concerns about mobility. So amongst the new generation coming through, a much more harmony in terms of a universal acceptance of challenges that affect humanity across cultures. So I think that there are more common denominators coming to the fore than there were previously. And of course, as you've seen the real rapid expansion of wealth in the East, you're also seeing a much more global perspective that I think does cross cultural boundaries. Having said that, I think any practitioner who's working with a family is obligated to work within the cultural framework and the cultural frame of reference of that family. I will give you an example without going into too much detail. I've often come into a situation where I'm talking about legacy planning with a particular parent, and that parent will turn around and say to me, if one of my children marries somebody from a different culture or faith, then I'm going to cut them out completely. And if you go back, maybe 100 years, that was a very, very common thing. That becomes less prominent, less evident. But what do you do in that situation? So that might not accord with my value system, but I have to work within the frame of reference of the clients. I can't tell the client family that, well, hang on a second, that's not my value system. It shouldn't be your value system. So you have to adjust and you have to work. In certain cultures, the Middle Eastern cultures, for example, the patriarchy in the family is a very, very strong, very strong cultural trend. In African societies, very often the matriarchy is a strong cultural trend. So you have to understand the culture of the people that you're working with, and I think be very sensitive and not to impose your own values, whether they're Western values, Middle Eastern values, or Eastern values, on the family that you're working with, but to work from within their frame of reference. I think there's the family governance, which is a set of principles. Then there's the governance structure, which I want to come to separately, because I think that involves a level of organization around governance.
Yep.
And then there's the question of how do you codify and should you codify
Yes.
that? And again, I'm going to come back to something I mentioned earlier when somebody knocks on the door and says, I'd like a family constitution. And you have to ask why. But assuming all the reasons are good and you want to move forward, the basis of a family constitution is agreement between the predominant family members of how they're going to conduct themselves going forward. That's got to be the basis of it. So unless you have, I guess if you were working as drafting a commercial contract between two parties, you'd know that you have to find the point of agreement between those two parties in order to actually conclude successfully a contract. It's a very similar situation. You have to actually have the parties who are relevant to the family's future agree and find agreement on key aspects of how they want to work. If you simply say, okay, and there are people that will do this, say, well, here's a document, here's a template agreement, template family constitution, you can just have one of those and it's going to cost you X amount of money. Well, to me, that's not worth the paper it's written on. If you have a series of discussions, of conversations, you build agreement around key things. And what are those key things? How are we going to function as a family in relation to ourselves, in relation to the family business, in relation to philanthropy, in relation to legacy planning, in relation to the roles and responsibilities of different people within the family, in relation to if we are employed or working within a family business, what are the terms and reference points of that employment? Those are how will we make our decisions going forward? Who will the leadership of the family be in terms of succession planning? and what will happen? What happens when we have a conflict, and how do we begin to resolve it? Do we have a conflict mechanism, a resolution mechanism in place? If we can deal with those things in principle, then we can actually convert that very readily into a written document, because you've agreed the basics, and you can translate that into and codify that. The beauty of codifying it, and this is a key point, is it's there not just for that group of people, but for the next generation and the generation that follows that, and so on. If one looks at legacy planning, being able to hand to the next generation a philosophy, an ethos, a way of doing things, is as important as handing to the next generation the financial wherewithal and assets that would enable people to do things. So I think you need both in place.
Then what are the practical, like the actual steps that you would take, like the processes when you create the whole structure for a family that you will adapt?
We have a very organic approach to dealing with families. What does that mean? It means that we look at each family as an individual, and we shape the roadmap according to that family's needs. And I can assure you one thing: no two families are the same, and no two roadmaps are the same. They do have some common milestones along the way. So the first thing that I think is really important is to understand the motivation of the person that's briefing you. And very often, most often, that's the head of family. Most often in our world, it's a patriarch. It doesn't necessarily have to be. But the important thing is to understand what the motivation is, why they want to enter this kind of discussion, and then to check that they're really prepared for it. So, if you're going to talk about succession planning, you have to begin to talk about when and at what time do you anticipate in your life surrendering a level of control, and including other people in decision making, including the next generation decision making. We would like to test all those assumptions, and we tend to do that on a one-to-one level. So we would tend to actually have one-to-one discussions with the family members. Now, obviously, if it's a multi-generational, huge family with many, many branches, that's not possible. But certainly within the referring elements of the family, we'd want to have those conversations. Very typically out of that, we would formulate, and we would begin to formulate an assessment of what we think the key opportunities and the key challenges are for that family, with a view to then bringing the entire family around the table. And we would tend to do that in the context of a family retreat. And that could be 1 or 2 days. It might be a little bit more. It might be 1 retreat. It might be 2. And we would the starting point there would be, let's understand what the forward view, the objectives, the vision is for this family, and what are and can we make explicit the values that you hold dear, and really begin to define those values in a clear way so they become tangible. They become a set of guidelines for you. Armed with that, here's a direction forward. Here's the key things that we find are absolutely important for our lives in terms of values. We can then begin to shape a discussion around legacy, continuity, around what might be the elements of a constitution, and we would work it, in a coherent and cohesive way with the family around the table. At times, there will be issues and there will be disagreements, and sometimes we'll break away and we'll have separate discussions and separate, sometimes negotiations between different parties in the family, etc. But we try to get, insofar as it's possible, to a cohesive output and a agreed output that says this is the basic framework around which this family can wish to operate. So that's the kind of building the agreement. Then you have to say, okay, if we then think about what does that mean in terms of real governance, structural governance, and that money becomes important in that. So when I say money becomes important, you've got management of businesses, management of assets. How do we create separation between the family as owners, the families potentially as executives, or potentially as investors who are where other people are running running either the investments or the underlying businesses, and to create sufficient structures, whether it's a family council, family board. You know, in many of these family businesses, they don't really have an articulated, well-defined board within the business. So everything is kind of mixed over together. So, you know, governance in the family, proper structuring in the family business. There is, you know, there is a reporting and accountability structure, whether it's family members running the business or the business is professionalized. And with respect to wealth management and investors, the same thing. There's a proper reporting structure, and that would do that. You know, if there are trusts and trustees involved, that would come into it as well. So you create those structures, you agree those structures, and then that gets translated and codified into a document which we call a family constitution or family charter. So what that family charter does is it doesn't simply say these are the rules or these are the soft rules that we've agreed. It says these are the soft rules that we've agreed, and these are the structures through which those soft rules are going to operate. And that begins to give it real substance and meaning, and it becomes a meaningful document then that helps the family conduct its affairs.
We've heard of the cases that families or their, you know, the family members, they do not really adhere to the structure, maybe over the generations. What suggestion or what steps you would suggest the family to take, not to really deviate too much?
Sometimes doing a family constitution can be a vanity project. And we've got one of these, and we've done the, you know, we've ticked all the boxes, and it's all looking lovely. And we've got a beautiful document, and you know, the guys that have done it for us have really gone to the bookbinders, and it looks beautiful as well. And we can put it on the shelf alongside the art books and the coffee books. So that's you know, that's the one thing. The other side of that is where there's real intention, but they can't somehow. Other stuff gets in the way. Either family events get in the way, or business gets in the way, or just general activity and busyness gets in the way. So to have, so there's a number of things that I think we can do. The one is to have a formalized calendar of an agreement about when meetings occur, and have those scheduled on an annual basis. Why do I say that's important? Because there will always be one family member who will adopt that and will be a stickler for that and will actually push it and say, we agreed that we were going to have a meeting on the 15th of July, and that's when we're going to have the meeting, and we'll push the family towards that. At a more slightly deeper level is the role of advisors, the role of people like yourselves, the role of people like myself, the role of lawyers, wealth managers, accountants, family office professionals, and so on, who surround the trustees, who surround the family, who guide the family, who also should be part of that annual calendar. So you actually begin to develop a regime around proper meetings, how those meetings are handled, the preparation that goes into those meetings. And the family will inevitably see value in that. Even if the value is simply perspective and reporting on the family's assets at the most minimal level, but then very, very often a discussion about family, the social aspects of family, education of the next generation, all those things come into those meetings. So I think professional advisors have an important role to play. Very often what I also recommend is that the family appoint to the family board, if there is a family board, what I would call non-family counsel. Now, that could be anything from somebody who, you know, people who work in family office. It could be a lot. It could be an old uncle. It doesn't have to be necessarily, a person or an accountant. The most important thing is somebody who can be seen to be impartial and trusted by the family, and that's a really, really important point. If you have non-family counsel who parts of the family don't trust, that becomes problematic. So if there's a trusted individual, and very often you find in families there is either somebody who's been around through the entirety of the family's existence, or somebody that they've met more recently who they all feel comfortable with appointing to that kind of role. And that person would have a similar kind of role as in a corporate situation as a non-executive director. It's obviously without the fiduciary responsibilities, but they play that kind of external, independent observer role that would help the family move forward. When you get to the family business, is to make sure that there's sufficient non-executive director appointments to the business board, because that's a really good way of reflecting back to the family what's working well and what's not working well. I think it's 2 or 3 or 4 things that actually that lead to that continuity. The one thing I would say to you is, when you look at it in that way, it's only the families that are really committed to actually doing things properly and making these things work that will invest the time and the effort and the funds, to have those people around and to make those and to make those appointments. The question of leadership, the question of perspective, the question of how do you see your family? It's so interesting, because very often when we go and speak to people and we ask the question of what are you considering, the enlightened leadership in families, the enlightened leaders often say to us, we want to look ahead for at least 100 years. And that's always like a breath of fresh air when you hear people thinking about very often people are humble. They say, I've been lucky, I've been able to create exceptional wealth. I understand that might happen once out of every 3 or 4 generations. It's not given that it happens in every generation. So I do want to think about how I do the best that I can for the generations that follow. And the only other thing I would add to that is, one of the things that we're seeing more and more now, and I think it's not just more recently, but you see it quite vividly in the modern world, is the appetite for philanthropy and for what I call activist philanthropy, where families use philanthropic projects, to actually bind themselves together and as a manifestation of their ethos and their values. And I think that is also important. Certainly it's where we can all help families not only think about their own continuity, their own future, but the future of the world and how they can contribute to that positively. And that's a very powerful, I think a powerful binding element amongst family members, as well as being a powerful contributor to the world at large.
Thank you. We've really had a very knowledgeable, inspiring, and powerful discussion today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I've really very much enjoyed speaking with both of you.